Welcome to my channel.
Hamish Macbeth was engaged in the delicate art of doing absolutely nothing when trouble first darkened the village of Lochdu. It was late morning, that awkward Highland hour when breakfast had long since vanished, but lunch was still a polite distance away, and Hamish sat in the corner of the front room of the Lochdu Hotel, with a mug of coffee cradled in both hands. He was slouched low in his chair, long legs stretched out, red hair uncombed, uniform worn in that faintly apologetic way that suggested he had slept in it, or at least considered doing so. Outside, Christmas lights were strung with heroic optimism along the main street. They blinked bravely against the grey drizzle, like drunken fireflies refusing to admit defeat. A plastic reindeer drooped outside the post office, one antler missing, giving it the air of a war veteran. Somewhere up the road, the wind worried at a loose bit of tin, producing a melancholy clatter that sounded suspiciously like the village sighing. Hamish sighed too. He had planned a very quiet day. There was a salmon run worth investigating, purely from a conservation standpoint, of course, and Mrs. Fletcher at the hotel had promised leftover mince and tatties if he stayed conveniently within reach. Best of all, headquarters in Strathbane had not rung since yesterday, and Hamish had developed a sixth sense for these things. If he kept still long enough, they might forget him entirely. Towser, his dog, lay at his feet, snoring gently, paws twitching as if dreaming of sheep. Hamish envied him. "You look busy," said Mrs. Fletcher dryly, appearing with a coffee pot. "Aye," said Hamish, "thinkin'." Mrs. Fletcher snorted and topped up his mug. "That'll be the day." Hamish smiled vaguely and stared out the window. The rain had thickened into that fine, penetrating Highland drizzle that soaked one's soul first and body later. It blurred the edges of the village, softened the stone cottages, and made Lochdu look like a place remembered rather than seen. And then the memory arrived in the form of a car. It was not the sort of car Lochdu approved of. Long, black, shiny to the point of vulgarity, it slid into the village like a well-fed eel, splashing through puddles without apology. It stopped outside the hotel with a decisive jerk, as if offended by the very idea of stopping anywhere at all. Hamish watched with mild disinterest sharpened by instinct. The door opened. A man stepped out. He was wrapped in a camel hair coat that looked far too expensive for the weather and wore shoes that would not survive 5 minutes on the moor. His hair was dark, slicked back, and his expression suggested that the world was a regrettable inconvenience, arranged purely to test his patience. A Sassenach, if ever Hamish had seen one. The man surveyed the village with narrowed eyes, as though Lochdu had personally disappointed him. He sniffed, glanced at his watch, and marched into the hotel. The room seemed to shrink slightly. Mrs. Fletcher stiffened. "Here we go," she muttered. The man strode up to the desk. "Is this the Lochdu Hotel?" he demanded, as if the sign outside might be lying. "It is," said Mrs. Fletcher pleasantly. "Well, I've a reservation." "That'll be nice," she said. Hamish hid a smile behind his mug. The man turned, finally noticing Hamish and Towser. His gaze lingered on Hamish's slouched posture, his unpolished boots, the dog hair clinging to his trousers. "Is he staff?" the man asked. Hamish blinked slowly, like a cow contemplating philosophy. "I'm the polis," he said at last. The man laughed. It was a sharp, unpleasant sound. "You're joking?" "No," said Hamish. The man sniffed again. "Extraordinary." He turned back to Mrs. Fletcher. "I'm Gerald Pembroke. I've purchased Brayview House." There it was. Mrs. Fletcher's smile froze. "Have you now?" "Yes. I'm converting it into a luxury Christmas retreat. Corporate guests. London money." He said this last as though it were a magic spell. Hamish's internal mind stirred, alert now. Brayview House sat on the hill above the village, a draughty old pile with more history than insulation. The locals had been quietly hoping it would collapse one winter and save everyone the bother. "A retreat," said Mrs. Fletcher faintly. "Exactly. I'll need reliable catering, staff, and absolute privacy. I expect the village to cooperate." There was a silence. Outside, a string of Christmas lights flickered, then steadied. Hamish took another sip of coffee. Gerald Pembroke had the look of a man who would not last long in Lochdu, or would last too long and be deeply regretted. "And what brings you here at Christmas?" Hamish asked mildly. Pembroke looked at him with irritation. find the season intolerable, but my investors insist on a festive launch. Frankly, I don't see the appeal. Glanced at the battered tinsel over the bar, the faint smell of pine cleaner, the village trying its best. Aye, he said, it's a strain. Pembroke huffed. Well, I'll be staying through the holidays. I expect things to be orderly. His eyes flicked meaningfully to Hamish's uniform. Hamish nodded. We're very orderly. Pembroke turned away, already dismissing him. Towser opened one eye and growled softly. That afternoon, the village buzzed like a disturbed hive. By evening, everyone knew about Gerald Pembroke. He'd complained about the lack of phone signal, criticised the hotel curtains, and suggested, loudly, that Loch Dhu could do with modernising. He defended the postmistress by asking if she took cards, the minister by calling the kirk quaint, and the curry shop owner by asking if anything was less pungent. By the time darkness fell, the Christmas lights were glowing bravely, reflected in wet pavement, and Loch Dhu had reached a quiet collective conclusion. They did not like Gerald Pembroke. Hamish walked home through the drizzle, collar turned up, Towser trotting beside him. The wind tugged at the lights, making shadows dance. Across the street, like uneasy spirits. Trouble, Hamish murmured. Towser wagged his tail. Hamish unlocked his cottage, already regretting the interruption to his peaceful season. Christmas in Loch Dhu was never dull. But murder, Hamish thought, would be going too far. The village, listening patiently in the rain, said nothing at all. Hamish slept badly that night, troubled not by visions of murder, but by the far more irritating thought of Gerald Pembroke reorganising the village to suit himself. He rose early, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and stood at his window, watching the dawn seep slowly into Loch Dhu. The Christmas lights were still glowing faintly, forgotten by whoever was meant to switch them off, and they made the street look oddly theatrical, as if the village were waiting for something to happen. It happened sooner than Hamish would have liked. He was halfway through his second mug when the phone rang. Hamish stared at it with deep suspicion, as though it might retreat if ignored. It rang again, sharp and insistent. Aye, he said at last. Hamish, shrieked Mrs. McLean from the post office. There's something terrible wrong up at Braveview House. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. What sort of wrong? I dinna ken how to say it. Ye'd best come. He pulled on his jacket, whistled for Towser, and set off up the hill. The path to Braveview House was slick with rain and pine needles, the wind cutting sharper the higher he climbed. The old house loomed out of the mist, its stone walls damp and dark, Christmas lights strung along the gate in a valiant but tasteless attempt at cheer. Mrs. McLean stood wringing her hands by the entrance, her breath puffing white. I came to deliver a parcel, she said. He never answered. Door was open. Hamish nodded and went inside. The hallway smelled faintly of polish and something more unpleasant underneath. Pembroke lay sprawled at the foot of the staircase, still wrapped in his expensive coat, one arm. Twisted beneath him at an awkward angle, a toppled box of decorations lay nearby, glass ornaments shattered across the stone floor like frozen tears. Hamish crouched, careful where he put his feet. Pembroke's eyes were open, staring at nothing, his face already slack. There was a thin trickle of blood at his temple. Towser sniffed, then sat quietly. Hamish sighed. That'll be my quiet day gone. He checked for a pulse out of habit, though he knew there'd be none. The body was cold. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, making the lights flicker. Mrs. McLean crossed herself. Was it an accident? Hamish looked at the staircase, the angle of the fall, the way the body lay. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. He sent Mrs. McLean back down to alert the doctor and, with obvious reluctance, Strathbane. Then he stood, hands in pockets, and simply looked. Pembroke's shoes were spotless despite the muddy path outside. His coat was damp, but not soaked. The decorations box was new, but one ornament clutched in Pembroke's hand was old, tarnished silver, out of place among the cheap glitter. Hamish straightened slowly. By the time DCI Blair arrived, the mist had thickened, and the village had gathered below the hill, buzzing with speculation. Blair burst into the hall like a storm in human form, red-faced and furious. "What the hell happened?" he barked. "Mornin', sir," said Hamish mildly. Blair rounded on him. Don't you mourn in me, a dead Englishman at Christmas. Do you know what this looks like? Hamish considered, untidy. Blair ignored him and jabbed a finger at the body. Clearly fell down the stairs, probably drunk. Case closed. Hamish scratched his chin. He didn't drink much. Blair spun. And how would you know that? Hotel gossip, said Hamish. He preferred mineral water. Blair snorted. Rubbish. I'll have the locals questioned. Someone didn't like him. That, Hamish thought, would narrow it down to everyone. As Blair shouted orders, Hamish drifted to the side, listening. He noted who hovered and who hung back, who looked shocked and who looked merely interested. Outside, the Christmas lights blinked steadily, illuminating faces one by one. Pembroke had arrived full of noise and promise. He lay silent now, and Lochdu, for once, was wide awake. Hamish felt the familiar irritation settle in his bones, the kind that came when other people made messes and expected him to tidy them without fuss. He watched Blair bully a constable and announce theories to anyone who would listen, and quietly filed away small details. A smear of mud on the wall nowhere near the stairs, the faint scent of expensive aftershave mixed with pine, the way Mrs. McLean kept glancing at the old ornament lying on the floor. Outside, someone laughed nervously. Someone else began to cry. The village was rearranging the story to make sense of it. Hamish knew better. Murder never made sense at first. It crept in sideways, hidden in foolishness. He bent, picked up the tarnished ornament, and slipped it into his pocket unnoticed. Certain Christmas in Lochdu was about to become Hamish left Braveview House with the ornament heavy in his pocket, and the sound of Blair's voice still bouncing irritably off the stone walls behind him. The path down the hill was crowded now, villagers edging close under the pretense of concern, their eyes bright with questions they would never ask directly. Hamish nodded here and there, giving away nothing, Towser trotting at his side with the solemn air of an officer attending a funeral. By the time he reached the village, the news had already settled like damp mist. Gerald Pembroke was dead. Opinions were forming faster than facts. Hamish detoured to the post office first, partly because his feet carried him there out of habit, and partly because Mrs. McLean had been the one to find the body. She stood behind the counter with a cup of tea untouched beside her, looking pale and affronted, as though death had breached the unspoken. Rules of decent behaviour. Terrible business, she said before Hamish could speak. Never liked the man, mind, always complaining. Still, you don't expect to find him sprawled like that. Did ye see anyone near the house this morning? Hamish asked gently. Mrs. McLean pursed her lips. No one unusual, though I did notice Mrs. Grant's car coming down the hill earlier than normal. She's not an early riser. Hamish nodded, storing it away without comment. He bought a newspaper he had no intention of reading and moved on. The curry shop was next, fragrant and warm, the owner shaking his head vigorously as Hamish entered. Very bad for business, he said. People do not eat happily when there is death. He argue with you? Hamish asked. With everyone, the man said cheerfully. He say my Christmas lights were tacky. Hamish almost smiled. At the hotel, Mrs. Fletcher was holding court, her version of events already polished. He slipped, she said firmly. I warned him about those stairs. Hamish sipped coffee she had thrust into his hands. He was decorating, so he said, though he asked for whiskey earlier, then didn't touch it. Strange, that. Hamish glanced at the bar. The whiskey glass sat where it always did, untouched, a faint ring of condensation marking time. Outside, Blair's car still blocked half the street. Hamish lingered just long enough to be noticed, and then wandered away again, whistling softly. Blair hated nothing more than being ignored, and Hamish had perfected the art. By mid-afternoon, the rain had eased, leaving the village washed and watchful. Hamish returned home, fed Towser, and finally examined the ornament. It was heavier than it looked, engraved faintly on the back with initials, E.G. He turned it over slowly, frowning. Elspeth Grant. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Elspeth was not the sort to kill anyone. Sharp-tongued, yes. Proud, certainly. Violent, no. Which meant the ornament was either meaningless or very important. Indeed. The phone rang again. Hamish let it ring twice before answering. Macbeth, Blair roared. Get back up here. The doctor says the fall didn't kill him. Hamish straightened. What did? Blow to the head. Before he fell, probably pushed. Hamish hummed. Aye, well? Blair snapped. Any bright ideas? Hamish looked out at the Christmas lights blinking patiently in the gathering dusk. Just that folk lie more when they think no one's listening. Blair swore and slammed the phone down. As Hamish pulled on his jacket again, Towser wagged his tail expectantly. The village was tightening around its secrets now, drawing them in close. Pembroke had come to Loch Dhu full of certainty, convinced money could smooth anything rough. Hamish smiled faintly. The Highlands had never agreed with that theory. Somewhere between the hotel and the kirk, someone was hiding the truth. And Hamish, appearing idle as ever, intended to sit very still until it grew uncomfortable enough to crawl out on its own. Hamish spent the rest of the afternoon wandering slowly through Loch Dhu, the rain gone but the streets still slick and glistening under the weak winter light. Towser padded beside him, ears twitching at every small sound, a cat scuttling across a roof, a shutter rattling in the wind, the distant clink of a mug from the hotel. Hamish observed, listened, and pretended to be absorbed in nothing at all. That was his advantage. When people thought him lazy or absent-minded, they forgot he was watching them. He stopped outside the post office, pretending to tie his boot, and noticed the postmistress giving him a fleeting look, as if weighing whether to share what she knew. "Nothing yet?" he asked casually. "Nothing much," she murmured. "Though you might want to ask about the carolers yesterday. There was a bit of a row near Braveview. Something about Mr. Pembroke complaining he couldn't hear them properly." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Row, ye say?" "Aye," she said. "Folk talk, ye ken." Miss Grant was involved. She didn't like him complaining. Hamish nodded thoughtfully, letting the information settle. It was minor, but in a village like Loch Dhu, minor often became significant. One complaint could ripple through the whole place. He continued to the hotel, where Mrs. Fletcher had just brewed a fresh pot of coffee. "You'll be needin' sustenance, I'd say," she said, placing a steaming mug before him. Hamish sipped, pretending to consider the question of breakfast versus second breakfast, all the while watching who came and went. Local faces appeared concerned, curious, fearful. Outsiders like Pembroke stirred disturbance and resentment wherever they went. Hamish made mental notes. By late afternoon, DCI Blair had returned with his team, filing into the hotel like a swarm of irritable bees. They were questioning the staff loudly, scribbling notes with frantic energy, and drawing firm but incorrect conclusions. Blair had decided that a falling accident was impossible and insisted on a homicide committed by someone the village would least suspect, which to him meant anyone local. Hamish observed quietly. He noticed the obvious signs Blair was missing. No one had taken note of the slightly damp footprints by the back door, nor the fine smudge of dirt on Pembroke's coat that led toward the library, rather than the staircase. He filed it away. Little things, seemingly unimportant, often told the real story. Towser whined softly, pulling Hamish's attention to a delivery boy lingering at the edge of the room, looking ill at ease. Hamish nodded once to the boy. Later, he would find out the lad had seen Pembroke arguing with someone in the library the night before. For now, he let it pass. Timing was everything. By evening, Hamish had wandered to the churchyard, where the minister was collecting his thoughts after Blair had interrogated him. The minister gave a faint sigh when he saw Hamish approach. "You have a better sense of people than those others," he said quietly. Pembroke was disliked, not by everyone, but enough to make his last days unpleasant. Hamish leaned on the gate, watching the village lights flicker in the half-dark. "And who?" he asked softly. "Miss Grant, I think," the minister admitted. "She has pride, and Pembroke—" He was cruel in a subtle way. Not loud, but cutting. He knew what buttons to press. Hamish noted it. He remembered the ornament, the initials E.G. found at Braveview House. Something small, overlooked, could tell a bigger story. Subtle cruelty was often punished with subtle vengeance. Night fell, and Hamish returned to his cottage, reluctant to confront Blair again. The officer's red face and loud voice had a way of fraying nerves, and Hamish had no interest in volunteering for that particular ordeal. Instead, he brewed tea and sat by the window, watching shadows stretch across the village. Towser rested his head on Hamish's knee, ears alert. He thought of Pembroke, sprawled and lifeless, and the small details that others missed, the tarnished ornament, the dirt on the coat, the faint scent of pine and leather. A murder in Loch Dhu was never about brute force or cunning. It was human, petty, personal, inevitable. Hamish considered how Pembroke's arrogance had bruised the pride of the village, how it had offended people who lived in quiet routines and measured days. The culprit would be someone underestimated, someone overlooked, someone who knew Pembroke's weaknesses as well as he had flaunted them. Towser growled softly, as though agreeing. Hamish smiled faintly. The solution would not come from shouting or conjecture. It would come from watching, listening, and letting the truth reveal itself in its own time. As midnight approached, Hamish wrote a short note to Blair, suggesting he might rest for the night and leave the questioning to tomorrow. Blair would be furious, of course, but the officer had to think he was indispensable. Hamish, meanwhile, would wait. He liked the quiet, and he liked the way the village's secrets whispered when you knew how to listen. The Christmas lights blinked steadily outside, reflecting in the wet pavements, casting gentle shadows across the cottages and shops. Somewhere in the village, someone was hiding a truth that would not remain hidden forever, and Hamish, appearing idle and unbothered, intended to be ready when it came out. It was a long night, and the Highlands were patient. Hamish was even more so. Morning came slowly over Loch Dhu, the sky a soft, mottled grey, promising neither snow nor sun but the kind of drizzle that seeped into bones and made one appreciate a thick coat and a hot breakfast. Hamish stirred awake with Towser already circling his boots, eager for the day's patrol. He sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading slowly, and thought about Pembroke, sprawled at Braveview House, and the slow, quiet work that would uncover the truth. He set off through the village, Towser padding silently beside him, ears twitching at the faintest sounds of life stirring. The streets were busy with ordinary activity, people exchanging cautious greetings, eyes flicking toward the hotel where Blair and his team were conducting interviews in the loud, conspicuous way that Hamish found profoundly exhausting. The villagers spoke in muted tones, careful with words, as if death had changed the rhythm of their speech. Hamish listened. That was what he did best. At the post office, Mrs. McLean offered him tea and a slice of fruitcake, eyes darting toward the hotel in concern. "I dinna like it," she whispered, leaning in. "Blair is going on about arrests already. He's got someone in mind." Hamish nodded, taking a small bite of cake. "And who would that be?" "The new lodger, I think. No one trusts him, but he was near the house yesterday." Hamish tapped the edge of his mug thoughtfully. He had expected Blair to leap to the obvious, the easiest suspect. That was always Blair's weakness. Hamish preferred to watch, to gather. He wandered slowly toward the curry shop next, the smell of spices greeting him warmly. The owner was polishing a brass lamp, shaking his head as he glanced at Hamish. "The police were here early, questioning everyone. They think it's an accident. But I ken better. Something wasn't right." Hamish leaned against the doorframe. "Something like what?" The man shrugged. The way he argued with Miss Grant. He thought he could lecture everyone, command the village. Some folk don't take kindly to that. Hamish nodded absently, thinking of the ornament with the initials E.G. tucked in his pocket. Subtlety mattered. Pembroke had been arrogant, but arrogance had a way of exposing the soft underbelly of a man who considered himself untouchable. By mid-morning, Hamish drifted to the hotel, where Blair had assembled a small crowd of villagers for questioning. The scene was chaotic, note-taking, loud assumptions, accusations half-formed. Blair barked and waved, pointing fingers at people who had been in the vicinity the previous day. "Someone knows more than they're telling," he shouted. Hamish leaned in quietly, noting who flinched, who kept their gaze steady, and who whispered to a neighbour. Hamish spotted Mrs. Grant standing at the edge, her expression carefully neutral. She met his gaze for a brief moment, a flicker of annoyance or perhaps worry passing through her eyes. Nothing overt, just a detail he filed away. Towser growled softly, nudging Hamish's leg, alerting him to the figure of a delivery boy lingering near the stairs. He looked anxious, fiddling with a parcel, eyes darting at Blair's interrogation. Hamish inclined his head toward him, a subtle gesture. The boy nodded imperceptibly and then moved toward the back of the hotel. Later, Hamish would learn that he had seen Pembroke arguing with someone the night before, but for now, the boy remained a quiet observer. Hamish left the hotel, claiming he needed to inspect the lights along the village street, and strolled slowly past the kirk. The minister was arranging hymn books, muttering quietly under his breath. Hamish paused. "You've spoken to everyone?" "Aye," the minister said, "yet I feel something is being hidden." Pembroke had a way of making people smaller than they were, making them hesitate. Someone is keeping their distance out of fear or shame. Hamish made a mental note, watching the minister adjust the candlesticks, hands trembling slightly. Subtle nervous energy was informative. He wandered on toward Braveview House, careful to appear casual. The gate creaked under his hand, but no one approached. The house looked colder in daylight, the ornaments scattered on the stone floor, a small, silent chaos. Hamish considered the placement of objects, the angle of shadows, the way the damp air clung to the stone. Every small detail whispered possibilities. Towser sniffed around the garden, nose down, tracking faint disturbances in the soil. Hamish followed quietly, noting footprints that led from the back door to the library and back again. They were not Pembroke's. They were smaller, lighter, careful. Someone had been there, perhaps the night before, perhaps even the morning of the fall. Hamish returned to the village in the late afternoon, thinking. Pembroke's death was not merely an accident. The circumstances suggested human intervention, but it was subtle, almost invisible, as if the killer had relied on arrogance and distraction to shield themselves. That, Hamish reflected, was exactly how a proud man like Pembroke would be undone. As dusk fell, he returned to his cottage, sat by the window with tea in hand, and watched the village prepare for another night under the blinking Christmas lights. People moved about cautiously, aware that something had shifted in their midst. Blair would continue shouting, making assumptions and focusing on the obvious. Hamish would wait, patient as ever, letting the village's whispers grow louder until the truth could no longer. Hide. Somewhere in Loch Dhu, someone had committed an act of calculated human folly, and Hamish knew that once it revealed itself, it would be small, petty, and entirely predictable. Towser nudged his hand for a final scratch before settling down. Hamish smiled faintly, sipping his tea. He was ready to listen. The killer, whether proud, frightened, or foolish, would soon leave a trail too clear to ignore, and Hamish would be there, pretending to be lazy as always. The lights blinked steadily outside, each pulse marking time toward revelation, and the village settled into an uneasy hush, unaware that the quiet policeman in the corner had already begun to see the pattern no one else noticed. The next morning brought a frost sharp enough to bite through boots and gloves, painting the village rooftops silver and turning every puddle into a mirror. Hamish stepped outside, Towser padding silently beside him, both of them taking their time as if the cold did not matter and the day held no urgency. But Hamish knew better. The frost would highlight footprints, reveal what had been hidden, and sometimes even whisper secrets if one watched closely. He wandered first to the lane behind the hotel, where the ground had dried just enough to hold the faintest impressions. A careful eye, and Hamish spotted them, shallow, deliberate footprints leading toward Braveview House's side entrance, almost invisible to the casual observer. Towser sniffed at them, wagging his tail as if approving the scent trail. Hamish crouched, tracing the marks with a gloved hand, noting the direction, size, and weight distribution. Someone had been there the night before or early that morning, likely moving carefully to avoid detection. From the corner of his eye, Hamish noticed movement near the hotel, Blair stomping about, red-faced, issuing orders, and looking as if the cold itself was an affront to his authority. Hamish turned away discreetly, knowing Blair would see no value in his careful scrutiny. Yet internally noting that the officer's distraction could work in his favour, he drifted toward the post office, thinking aloud. Footprints like that, someone light on their feet. Deliberate, calculated. Mrs. McLean glanced at him, eyebrows raised, unsure if he was thinking or merely muttering to himself. Hamish gave her a small, vague smile. "Don't worry, just the frost helping me along." Tea and a slice of shortbread later, Hamish continued his meandering through the village, making a point of being seen as idle. Villagers passed, whispering questions, but Hamish greeted them softly, asking the most innocuous questions while mentally mapping the threads of information he had collected. Everyone had an angle: complaints about Pembroke's arrogance, sightings of figures near the house, subtle exchanges between locals that had seemed meaningless the day before. At the hotel, he overheard Blair lecturing a trembling young clerk on the importance of honesty, implying that someone had withheld crucial information. Hamish stayed in the doorway, drinking coffee and observing. The clerk was nervous, fidgeting, clearly more frightened of Blair than willing to reveal anything substantial. Hamish noted the clerk's posture, the way his eyes flicked toward the kitchen and back. Something had caught his attention there, something he was unwilling to articulate in front of Blair. Hamish drifted toward the kitchen under the guise of stretching his legs, Towser padding silently at his heels. The cook, a woman of strong opinions and a taste for gossip, was washing dishes. "Morning, Hamish," she said. "You'll want to see what was left in the pantry last night. Mr. Pembroke got into a bit of a kerfuffle, I heard. Something about the preserves." Hamish paused. "Kerfuffle?" The cook shrugged. "Aye. Spoons flying, jars clattering. Nothing dangerous, mind. But someone was clearly agitated. He filed that away. Human emotions, small irritations, they often pave the road to violence. A man like Pembroke, arrogant and insensitive, could easily provoke someone who otherwise appeared harmless." By mid-morning, Hamish made his way to the back of Brayview House. The side entrance was secured, but the frost revealed more faint prints. Hamish knelt, examining the edges, noting where the weight had shifted. Someone had carried something heavy, or at least awkward, into the house. Towser sniffed, alerting him to a faint scent of wood polish mixed with Pembroke's distinct aftershave. The combination was unusual, a detail unnoticed by anyone else. Returning to the village, Hamish stopped at the church. The minister was outside, raking leaves, his breath steaming in the cold air. "You see, Hamish," the minister said, "people like Pembroke leave marks, even when they think no one is looking. But the marks that matter are the ones left on those around them." Hamish nodded. "Aye. And sometimes they leave marks without even knowing it themselves." He noticed the minister's hands were still trembling slightly, not fear but unease. A clue. Small, human, telling. Toward evening, Hamish returned to his cottage, the sky turning an almost bruised purple. He brewed a strong tea and sat by the window, reviewing his notes in his head. Pembroke's fall had been too precise to be accidental. The ornament with the initials E.G. suggested a connection, subtle but deliberate. Footprints led to the side entrance, frost-preserved details that Blair would ignore. People were holding back, consciously or unconsciously. The pattern was emerging. Outside, the Christmas lights flickered in the damp darkness. The village moved around him, unaware that one among them had committed a deliberate act of harm. Hamish felt the familiar irritation settle. The work of others would be blamed on him if he intervened too openly. He had to remain idle, invisible, patient. Towser lay at his feet, ears twitching. Hamish sipped tea and allowed his mind to wander over small details. A misplaced cup at the hotel, a nervous glance by the clerk, the minor scratches on the floor of Brayview's library. Each piece formed a thread. Pulling one would unravel the whole, and Hamish knew which one to tug when the time was right. Night deepened, and the lights outside continued their steady blink. Somewhere in Lochdu, the person responsible for Pembroke's injury was hiding behind a carefully constructed mask of normalcy. Hamish, pretending to be idle and unconcerned, was already steps ahead, tracking invisible footprints and listening to whispers the village did not even know it was sharing. The truth was close. He could feel its presence. And when it revealed itself, it would be small, human, and utterly undeniable. Hamish took another slow sip of tea, satisfied with his patient progress. He had done nothing visible, yet he had done everything necessary. The Highlands were patient, and so was he. The day's observations had built a quiet, irresistible web, one that would not be ignored, and when the next move came, Hamish would be ready. Towser wagged his tail once, and Hamish smiled faintly, knowing the village's secrets would speak soon enough. The morning broke over Lochdu with a pale, watery light that filtered through low clouds, making the village seem smaller, closer, almost secretive. Hamish lingered at his window, watching the frost melt into rivulets along the gutters and streets, carrying with it the faintest traces of footprints from yesterday. Towser nosed at the door impatiently, and Hamish knew he had to move before the day crowded him out of the quiet that revealed so much. He strolled toward the hotel, ostensibly for another cup of coffee, but really to observe. Blair was already there, his red face a beacon of agitation. He barked orders at the staff, demanding a detailed timeline of Pembroke's last hours. Hamish leaned casually against the doorway, hands in his pockets, and listened without being noticed. He caught a fragment of conversation from the clerk, muttered under breath. Pembroke had argued with someone in the library before retiring to his room. Blair ignored it, dismissing it as irrelevant. Hamish smiled faintly. That was precisely the detail he needed. Arrogant men often provoked quiet people into doing things they later regretted. He noted which way the clerk's eyes flicked, and the way his hands twisted nervously around the edge of the counter. Subtle signs, almost invisible, yet full of meaning. He left the hotel and wandered toward Brayview House once more. The house was quiet, shrouded in frost and early winter mist. Hamish approached the side entrance, Towser sniffing at the doorframe, and inspected the ground. The footprints from the previous day were still faintly visible, though softened by frost melt. They led toward the library, confirming the clerk's hint. Hamish crouched, tracing the shallow impressions, observing the way weight had shifted, noting the careful movements. Whoever had been here was deliberate, small, precise. He wandered slowly inside, pretending to inspect the Christmas decorations and scattered ornaments, careful not to disturb anything. The tarnished silver ornament, with the initials E.G. lay where he had placed it, unnoticed by Blair and his team. He picked it up briefly, turning it over in his hand, and considered its significance. Elspeth Grant's initials, no doubt. But why would a trinket be left here, in Pembroke's hand, if she were innocent? Was it meant to mislead, or had it fallen inadvertently during a struggle? Hamish's mind worked quietly, cataloguing the possibilities. Pembroke had been arrogant, tactless, capable of causing offence without raising suspicion. That made the suspect list both long and specific. Someone who felt overlooked, underestimated, or insulted. Someone whose temper Pembroke had tested without realising it. He considered Miss Grant carefully. She had the pride and social polish to conceal motive, yet the ornament suggested a connection. Small details were rarely accidental. Towser tugged him back toward the door, reminding him that observations outside were just as important. Hamish stepped back into the garden, noting minor disturbances in the soil, the position of a fallen wreath, and a faint scrape along the windowsill. Each tiny irregularity suggested movement, a sequence of actions invisible to those not looking closely. Later, he returned to the village, moving casually along the main street while the villagers went about their day under the dim winter sky. Conversations fluttered past, mostly mundane, but Hamish caught half a remark here, a glance there. Someone had seen Pembroke speaking sharply to another visitor, a fleeting exchange dismissed at the time. Someone else had noticed a strange arrangement of furniture in the library, pieces of a puzzle, scattered and subtle, yet each adding to the overall picture. Hamish stopped briefly at the post office, speaking quietly with Mrs. McLean. "Anything unusual last night?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "Nothing blatant, but Mr. Pembroke was vexing folk, and there were glances, whispers, things that fade if you don't pay attention. Just the sort of things I like noticing," Hamish murmured, pocketing the note she had hesitated to give him. By afternoon, Hamish returned to his cottage, moving deliberately slowly to avoid Blair's attention. The officer's team had begun questioning residents more aggressively, and Hamish preferred to work at a pace that allowed observation without interference. Inside, he brewed strong tea, sipped slowly, and reviewed his mental map, the tarnished ornament, the footprints, the nervous clerk, the minister's subtle anxiety. Each connected to Pembroke's arrogance, each suggesting human motivation rather than accident. He thought about the sequence: argument in the library, careful movement through the house, confrontation near the staircase, the fall. Small details, he realised, were critical. The angle of the fall, the objects scattered about, the way Pembroke's own actions had contributed. Human folly rarely happened in isolation. Towser settled at his feet, and Hamish leaned back, letting his mind wander over the village's quiet whispers. Someone had acted, someone underestimated, someone who believed a careless man could be controlled. It was petty, human, and entirely predictable in its timing and execution. Evening approached, casting a muted glow over Loch Dhu. The Christmas lights blinked in steadfast rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the turbulence of human emotions below. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile. He had not yet spoken to Blair, had not made any moves visible to others, yet the investigation was progressing. Patience was his tool. Observing, listening, letting the threads of human behaviour reveal themselves. This was how the mystery would unravel. Somewhere in the village, the person responsible for Pembroke's death or injury had left their mark, subtle and hidden. but undeniable to a careful eye. Hamish sipped the last of his tea, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. Towser twitched in his sleep. Outside, the village moved in quiet routine, unaware that a pattern had emerged, one small human misstep away from revelation. Hamish was ready. He would watch, wait, and let the village itself yield the answer. The truth was close, as patient as he was, and Loch Dhu would not be long in showing it. The following morning brought a faint drizzle, the kind that softened edges and made every shadow in Loch Dhu seem longer, more mysterious. Hamish stepped from his cottage, Towser already circling his boots with impatience, and moved slowly through the quiet village streets. Each puddle reflected the muted lights of the Christmas decorations, and in their distorted glow, footprints and impressions revealed themselves more clearly than the eye could initially detect. He drifted first toward Braveview House, pretending to be idly inspecting the fallen decorations along the gate. The side entrance, which yesterday had revealed faint footprints, now offered more information. The dampness of overnight rain had blurred the shallow marks, but Hamish could still trace the direction and careful rhythm of whoever had passed through. They had moved deliberately, with measured steps, yet light enough to suggest a smaller frame. Towser sniffed at the edge of the door, and Hamish nodded, filing the detail away. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine, polish, and the lingering tang of Pembroke's cologne. The tarnished ornament lay where Hamish had left it, a subtle clue unnoticed by the others. He picked it up and turned it over slowly, examining the initials E.G. again. Elspeth Grant. The connection was tempting, but he reminded himself that appearances often misled, especially in a village accustomed to subtleties and polite concealments. Hamish moved toward the library, observing the faint scuffs on the floor and the subtle indentation of a chair that had been slightly moved. He crouched, noting how the dust had shifted, and the way faint scratches suggested that someone had leaned heavily on the desk, perhaps in argument, perhaps in haste. Each small sign told a story Blair and his team would miss, blinded by loud assumptions and the need to appear authoritative. Stepping back into the garden, Hamish surveyed the scene with an almost casual eye. Frost and lingering moisture highlighted minor disturbances, a broken twig by the back hedge, faint traces of soil pressed into the doorstep, a subtle scrape along the library window frame. These were deliberate movements, invisible to anyone who did not look for intention behind the minutiae. Hamish made mental notes, cataloguing them against the behaviour of the villagers and what he already knew about Pembroke's interactions. He wandered slowly back into the village, moving past the post office where Mrs. McLean greeted him with a faintly worried smile. "Any news?" she asked softly, as if voicing the thought might summon the answer. Hamish shook his head casually. "Just watching the village wake. Things will show themselves when people forget to hide." She poured him a quick cup of tea, and he took it without comment, eyes scanning the street. Gossip floated in whispers, barely audible, but Hamish caught enough. A mention of Miss Grant visiting the house late the previous evening, a fleeting reference to a disagreement over the Christmas lights, someone noting the odd behaviour of a newcomer near the hotel. Hamish meandered toward the hotel, observing Blair conducting his investigation with increasing irritation. The officer's face was red, his movements loud, hands waving as he attempted to marshal information from villagers who were either frightened or unwilling. Hamish stayed at the edge of the scene, noting reactions, quiet shifts of posture, nervous glances toward corners where the officer's attention would never reach. Towser tugged at him gently, guiding him toward the alley behind the hotel where a delivery boy lingered. Nervously, Hamish approached, adopting an expression of benign curiosity. "Did you see anything unusual yesterday?" he asked softly. The boy's eyes widened slightly. Then he leaned in and whispered about an argument he had glimpsed between Pembroke and someone in the library, small words barely formed, yet significant. Hamish nodded, letting him retreat without drawing attention. The afternoon passed with Hamish continuing his unobtrusive rounds, cataloguing minutiae, the alignment of chairs at the church, a slightly ajar cupboard door at the bakery, faint scuffs on steps leading into the hotel. Each was a small deviation from routine, evidence of human presence that would be invisible to anyone not looking for intention behind action. Returning to his cottage as dusk fell, Hamish brewed a strong pot of tea and sat by the window, reviewing his observations. Pembroke's fall was not accidental, yet it was subtle. Blame shifted easily, and motive was human. Irritation, pride, the small cruelties that Pembroke had inflicted without consequence until now. The tarnished ornament, the footprints, the nervous clerk, and the whispers of the villagers formed a delicate lattice pointing towards someone underestimated. Towser rested at his feet, ears twitching. Hamish sipped his tea and considered the next steps. The killer would act with caution, relying on Pembroke's arrogance to shield them. But even the most careful person left traces. The day's observations had narrowed the field: movement in the library, footprints near the side entrance, nervous behaviours, subtle tensions among villagers. The truth was visible to those patient enough to notice. Outside, the Christmas lights blinked steadily in the growing darkness, reflecting on wet pavements and icy puddles. The village carried on with quiet normality, unaware that the sequence of human folly had left marks Hamish could read. Every detail, however small, contributed to the emerging picture. Hamish leaned back, letting the quiet settle over him. He had not interfered, had not alerted Blair, had not announced his observations. Yet in his mind the investigation was progressing, thread by invisible thread. The murderer, petty, careful, underestimated, had left subtle signs, and soon these would align to reveal the truth. As night deepened over Loch Dhu, Hamish felt the familiar satisfaction of anticipation. He would wait, watch, and listen, letting human behaviour reveal what words and accusations could not. The village held its secrets close, but patience and subtle observation always won. Somewhere among the houses, someone carried guilt, and Hamish knew that before long it would slip through the carefully constructed mask. Towser stirred. Hamish took a slow sip of tea, and outside, the blinking lights continued their quiet vigil, counting down toward revelation. Morning arrived over Loch Dhu in a pale wash of grey, the kind that made the mountains look distant and secretive, the village smaller than usual and full of hushed possibilities. Hamish stepped out of his cottage, Towser padding at his heels, sniffing the damp air. There was a crispness to the frost that lingered in patches along the streets, and Hamish knew that even the smallest impressions, footprints, scuffs, shifted leaves, would hold clues if one took the time to notice. He drifted first to Braveview House, moving with the casual gait of a man taking a morning walk, yet his eyes scanned every detail. The side entrance still bore faint traces of footprints, blurred slightly by melting frost but clear enough to suggest a deliberate, careful approach. Towser nosed the ground and growled softly. Hamish inclined his head in approval. The person who had moved this way had done so cautiously, avoiding unnecessary disturbance, likely carrying or shifting something important. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine, dampness, and the lingering tang of Pembroke's cologne. Hamish crouched beside the scattered ornaments, noticing. Once again, the tarnished silver trinket with the initials E.G. He turned it over, considering Elspeth Grant, and tried to imagine how it had ended up in Pembroke's hand. It could be innocent, an accident, or a deliberate clue left by someone trying to mislead. The details were subtle, and Hamish knew the truth was hidden in their quiet consistency. He wandered toward the library, careful to avoid disturbing any dust or footprints. Small scuff marks along the floor and minor scratches on the desk suggested recent movement, a struggle perhaps, or a heated exchange. Hamish noted them, cataloguing each for the pattern they might form. Blair and his team would overlook these, convinced that loud gestures and accusations were the path to understanding. But Hamish preferred the quiet work of observation. Towser tugged at him gently, and Hamish followed toward the back garden. There, the faint scrape along the windowsill, a broken twig, and a subtle indentation in the soil gave more insight. The perpetrator had been methodical, careful, leaving as little evidence as possible, yet even careful people made mistakes. Hamish's mind ran over every detail, linking each small error into a map of movements that only someone patient could read. By mid-morning, Hamish returned to the village, drifting casually past the post office. Mrs. McLean greeted him with a smile that betrayed worry. "Morning, Hamish. Did you see anything?" "Just the village waking," he said, taking the tea she offered, and watching the street. Whispers floated on the air, mention of Miss Grant visiting Braveview House late the night before. Remarks about Pembroke's arrogant complaints during the carolers' arrival, fleeting observations of newcomers or villagers acting nervously. Hamish noted all of it without comment. Patterns emerged in fragments, and he had learned that people often revealed more when they believed they were saying nothing. The hotel drew his attention next, where Blair's agitation had increased. The officer barked instructions, demanded detailed timelines, and insisted that everyone's memory be accurate and complete. Hamish lingered at the edge of the room, observing reactions, a nervous clerk fidgeting, glances toward the kitchen, hesitant exchanges with other staff. Even those who were innocent displayed small tells when under pressure, and Hamish catalogued each one. Towser nudged him toward the alley behind the hotel, where a delivery boy lingered, shifting uneasily. Hamish approached casually. "Did you see anything unusual yesterday?" he asked softly. The boy hesitated, then whispered about a brief argument between Pembroke and someone in the library. The words were small, almost insignificant, but Hamish noted them carefully. He nodded, letting the boy slip away before Blair's attention could catch him by afternoon. Hamish's route took him past the church and bakery, where small anomalies in the environment revealed more than conversations ever could. Slightly ajar cupboards, misaligned chairs, scuffed floors, all pointed to the presence of someone who had moved deliberately, someone aware of how to hide their intentions. Each detail, minute and quiet, contributed to a pattern, one that Blair would dismiss as inconsequential. Returning to his cottage as dusk approached, Hamish brewed a strong pot of tea and settled near the window, reviewing the day's observations. Pembroke's fall had been deliberate. The ornament suggested a connection to Elspeth Grant, or at least someone wishing to imply one. Footprints, nervous glances, subtle tensions, all indicated a calculated act rooted in human frailty, pride, irritation, perhaps revenge. Outside, the Christmas lights blinked steadily against the deepening twilight. The village moved in cautious routine, oblivious to the subtle web forming around Pembroke's death. Hamish sipped his tea, letting the warmth spread through him, appreciating the quiet. He had done nothing visible, yet everything necessary had been accomplished. The threads were in place, the patterns emerging, and the truth waiting to step forward. Patience, as always, was the key. The murderer, petty and underestimated, had left a trail too delicate for the casual eye, but entirely readable to one who observed without interference. Hamish leaned back, Towser resting at his feet, and let his mind trace the connections. Library scuffle, footprints, nervous clerk, tarnished ornament. The pieces would align, and when they did, the village would not mistake the subtle human error for coincidence. Night deepened over Loch Dhu, and Hamish felt the familiar anticipation. Every quiet detail, every overlooked nuance, moved him closer to the solution. He would wait, watch, and listen, allowing human behavior to reveal what words and loud assumptions could not. Somewhere among the cottages and shops, the person responsible carried a carefully maintained mask, but it was only a matter of time before it slipped. The lights outside continued to blink, rhythmical and patient. Hamish took a long sip of tea and smiled faintly. The web was set, the truth was close, and when the next move came, he would be ready, quietly observing, appearing idle, as always. The morning mist clung to Loch Dhu like a gauzy veil, softening the edges of cottages, stone walls, and the distant hills. Hamish stepped out of his cottage with Towser padding at his heels, his eyes scanning the streets for the smallest irregularities. Frost lingered in patches, marking footprints and the subtle displacement of leaves, each hinting at movements unseen and unspoken. Hamish enjoyed these moments, the slow gathering of invisible evidence, the quiet puzzle that only patience could solve. He wandered toward Brayview House once more, his gait casual, as if strolling for the sake of air and exercise. The side entrance bore traces of footprints he had noted yesterday, faint now in the thawing frost, but still readable to the trained eye. Hamish crouched, tracing the shallow marks with his gloved fingers, noting how someone had shifted weight carefully, stepped lightly, and avoided any unnecessary disturbance. Towser sniffed at the doorstep, tail wagging faintly, and Hamish nodded. Subtle movements, deliberate yet nearly invisible, were more revealing than any confession. Inside, The house smelled of damp wood, faint pine, and Pembroke's lingering cologne. Hamish inspected the library again, noting the slight scuffs on the floorboards, the dust disturbed around the desk, and the alignment of books on the shelves. Each element was a word in the story no one else could read. Blair's team had come and gone, making loud, erroneous assumptions, dismissing everything subtle as inconsequential. Hamish smiled faintly at their ineptitude. They were loud, but they were blind. The tarnished silver ornament lay where Hamish had left it, faintly catching the morning light. He turned it over in his hand, considering its significance. Elspeth Grant's initials, deliberate, careless, or coincidental. Small details were rarely meaningless. Pembroke had been arrogant, careless with his words and gestures. Someone had exploited that weakness. Hamish filed the thought away, cataloguing what was solid evidence versus what was likely intended misdirection. Towser tugged him toward the back garden. There, Hamish noticed a faint scrape on the window frame, a broken twig, and the subtle indentation of a heel in the soil. The perpetrator had been deliberate, methodical, and light on their feet, careful to avoid leaving obvious traces. Hamish made mental notes, layering them onto yesterday's observations, footprints, nervous glances from the villagers, and whispers overheard while pretending to be idle. The pattern was emerging, quiet but insistent. By late morning, Hamish drifted toward the village centre, stopping at the post office. Mrs. McLean offered him tea, her eyes flicking nervously toward the hotel. "Any news?" she asked softly. Hamish shook his head. "Nothing yet, just noticing how the village wakes. People reveal more than they think, if you're patient enough." She smiled faintly, pouring tea. Hamish sipped, eyes scanning the street. Voices were low, cautious, half-whispered fragments. Someone had seen Miss Grant near Brayview late the previous night. A remark about Pembroke's complaints over the carolers. Someone noting a newcomer acting strangely near the hotel. These were small, easily overlooked, yet they built the outline of a story in Hamish's mind. The hotel drew his attention next, where Blair was in full lecture mode, red-faced and flustered. He barked instructions, demanded detailed recollections from villagers, and interpreted every nervous glance as guilt. Hamish leaned casually in the doorway, noting reactions. The clerk fidgeting, eyes darting toward the kitchen, lips pressed tight. People under pressure revealed more than words ever could. Hamish filed the subtle signs, each a thread in a web Blair would never see. Towser nudged him toward the alley behind the hotel, and Hamish approached the delivery boy loitering there. "Did you notice anything unusual yesterday?" he asked quietly. The boy hesitated, then whispered about an argument he had glimpsed in the library, brief, tense, and almost invisible to anyone else. Hamish nodded, letting him retreat without attracting attention. Every fragment mattered. By mid-afternoon, Hamish drifted past the church and bakery, noting anomalies, slightly misaligned chairs, cupboards ajar, scuffs on the floor. Each imperfection was a silent testimony to human presence and intention. Subtle evidence, overlooked by others, began forming a pattern only patience could reveal. Returning to his cottage as dusk fell, Hamish brewed tea and reviewed his mental map. Pembroke's fall was deliberate, small but human, in motivation, irritation, pride, or petty revenge. The ornament, footprints, nervous clerk, and whispered fragments connected to someone. Underestimated, capable of acting with precision and subtlety. The pattern pointed, quietly but unmistakably, to someone who believed themselves invisible. The Christmas lights blinked rhythmically, reflecting in puddles and wet streets. Villagers moved in cautious normality, unaware that a carefully constructed web surrounded Pembroke's death. Hamish sipped tea, letting the warmth spread through him, satisfied. He had done nothing conspicuous, yet everything necessary had been achieved. The threads were visible, and the truth waited, patient. Patience was the key. The murderer had left subtle traces, and they would eventually emerge. Hamish leaned back, Towser resting at his feet, and let the quiet settle. Every detail, library scuffle, footprints, nervous glances, tarnished ornament, would converge. The village would not mistake human folly for coincidence. Night deepened over Loch Dhu, and Hamish felt the familiar anticipation. The village held its secrets tightly, but observation and patience revealed all. The person responsible carried a carefully maintained mask, but Hamish knew it was only a matter of time before it slipped. The lights outside continued to blink steadily, counting down toward revelation. Hamish took a long sip of tea, smiled faintly, and settled in. He would watch, wait, and let human nature do the rest. The morning broke clear and crisp, with the sun glinting off the frost that had returned overnight. Hamish stretched, Towser already nudging him insistently toward the door, and stepped out into the quiet village streets. The air was sharp, clean, and full of possibility. Today, he sensed, the threads he had been following would finally converge. He strolled casually past the hotel, noting Blair in the midst of another loud, misguided interrogation. The officer was red-faced, waving papers and shouting at a trembling clerk who looked ready to faint. Hamish ignored them, focusing instead on the subtle cues he had gathered over the past days. The footprints leading to Braveview House, the tarnished ornament with E.G., the nervous glances, the whispered fragments of conversation, and the small disturbances no one else had noticed. Braveview House appeared quiet, unassuming in the sunlight. Hamish approached the side entrance, Towser at his side, and traced the faint marks one last time. The pattern was undeniable. Someone had moved deliberately, quietly, taking advantage of Pembroke's arrogance and overconfidence. Hamish had known from the start that the culprit was someone underestimated, someone who seemed helpful, invisible, or polite. He entered the house, pretending to inspect the Christmas decorations, and made his way toward the library. There, he found Miss Grant arranging books, her movements precise, calm, but not natural. There was a stiffness, a small hesitation in the way she adjusted a shelf that immediately caught Hamish's attention. "Morning," he said softly. "You're up early." Elspeth looked up, startled, then composed herself. "Yes, I thought I'd check things before the guests arrive, the decorations, the house." Her voice trailed off. Hamish crouched, picking up the tarnished ornament again. Funny thing, this ended up in Pembroke's hand. He let the silence stretch, watching her carefully. "And yet, it seems to belong to you." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. She opened her mouth to speak, hesitated, then said, It must have fallen. I didn't. Accidents happen," Hamish said gently, standing and placing the ornament on the desk. "But the footprints, the subtle marks, the disturbances in the garden, they tell a story too. One that words alone wouldn't." Elspeth's composure faltered, just enough. The weight of her guilt, previously hidden behind social polish and polite avoidance, showed itself in the tight set of her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked toward the window and back. Hamish nodded slowly. "Pembroke was careless, yes. But you acted deliberately, didn't you? To stop him from humiliating someone, or perhaps from revealing something he shouldn't have." She looked at him, lips pressed tight, then sighed, almost inaudibly. "He wouldn't leave me alone about the lights, the ornaments, my family. I didn't mean to—" Hamish stepped closer. "It's human, understandable, even, but actions have consequences. You underestimated him, and it went further than you expected." At that moment, Towser growled softly, stepping between them as if emphasizing the unspoken truth. Elspeth's gaze fell to the dog, then back to Hamish. She shook her head, defeated, and admitted quietly, "Yes, I pushed him. He lost his balance. It was meant to scare him only. I didn't know." Hamish's eyes were calm, unreadable, and that explains the footprints, the minor scuffles in the library, the way the ornaments were displaced. Everything fits now. It's not just an accident. It's human folly, pride, and misjudgment. Classic, petty, and entirely predictable. Outside, the village went about its quiet morning routine, oblivious to the confession taking place within Braveview House. Hamish guided Elspeth toward the main door. Towser trotted beside them, tail wagging lightly. She made no resistance. The weight of her actions and their consequences were already settling upon her. At the hotel, Blair erupted into another tirade, convinced he would be the one to solve the case. Hamish remained in the background, silently observing. There was no need to argue, no need to take the spotlight. Let Blair seize the credit. Hamish had done what mattered. He had preserved the truth, understood it, and prevented further harm. Back at his cottage that evening, Hamish settled by the fire with a cup of steaming tea. Towser at his feet. The village had returned, at least superficially, to normal. The Christmas lights blinked softly outside, each pulse marking the passage of time, the return of quiet routine, and the subtle triumph of observation, patience, and human understanding. Over bluster and assumption, Hamish allowed himself a small smile. He had uncovered the truth, ensured justice, and yet avoided any chance of promotion or transfer. Life in Loch Dhu would continue at its own lazy, unpredictable pace, and he would remain where he belonged, quietly attentive, unobtrusive, and content. Towser let out a satisfied sigh, and Hamish took another slow sip of tea, letting the warmth fill him. The village slept under the soft glow of the Christmas lights, secrets revealed but lives intact, and Hamish knew that all was as it should be. Small human folly, gentle justice, and patient observation had prevailed, and the Highlands, as always, remained quietly magnificent.